What if I told you that somewhere in a filing cabinet, in a basement, in a building most Americans couldn't name, there's a record of something your government did that would keep you up at night if you let it? Not a theory, not a rumor whispered in some corner of the internet. A document, stamped, filed, and eventually declassified, whether anyone wanted it to be or not. Over the next little while, I'm going to walk you through 99 of these moments. Some are well known, most are not. A few are still disputed, still argued over by historians and researchers who don't fully agree on what happened or why. And where that's the case, I'll say so, because this isn't about convincing you of a conspiracy. It's about sitting with the strange, uncomfortable, occasionally unbelievable things that are simply part of the historical record. This isn't a story meant to alarm you. Think of it more like a long walk through a quiet, dimly lit hallway, one where every door leads to a different decade, a different agency, a different set of people who thought they were doing what needed to be done. Some of what you'll hear is horrifying. Some of it is almost darkly funny in how absurd it sounds. All of it is real enough to have left a paper trail. So dim the lights if you haven't already. Get comfortable. Let your mind slow down, because this is the kind of history that's best absorbed slowly, item by item, without rushing to any conclusions. And before we drift into the first one, if you don't mind, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It genuinely helps these stories find the people who want to hear them, and it costs you nothing but a second of your night. All right, get settled in. Let's begin with number 1. Back in 1932, in a quiet corner of Alabama, where a study began that would run for 40 years longer than anyone could have imagined. 1. The White House fire of 1814. In August of that year, during the War of 1812, British troops marched into Washington and set fire to nearly every major government building, including the presidential mansion. Soldiers reportedly sat down at the dining table first, eating a meal that had been prepared for President Madison before he fled the city. Then they piled up furniture, doused it with lamp oil, and lit the place ablaze. The fire burned through the night, gutting the interior completely. By morning, only the outer sandstone walls remained standing, blackened and scorched, a shell of what had once been the young nation's most symbolic building. Some historians describe the act as retaliation for an earlier American raid on York, present-day Toronto, where government buildings had also been burned. Whether it was pure military strategy or something closer to a message meant to humiliate a young country still finding its footing is a question historians continue to debate. What's certain is the psychological impact. For a brief moment, the United States government had no functioning executive residence. Cabinet members scattered, documents were lost. The seat of American power sat in ruins for the world to see. It would take 3 years of reconstruction before the building was habitable again, and even longer before it truly resembled what had stood there before. The event remains one of the only times in American history that a foreign power occupied and destroyed the White House itself, a fact that tends to surprise people who assume the building has always simply existed, untouched by war. It hadn't. And the story of what happened just before that fire is even stranger. 2. Dolley Madison's escape. As British troops approached the Capitol, First Lady Dolley Madison remained in the White House far longer than most advisors thought was safe. Reports suggest she stayed behind specifically to oversee the removal of important documents and valuables, even as messengers arrived warning that the enemy was close enough to see. According to popular accounts, she refused to leave until a full-length portrait of George Washington had been secured, insisting it could not fall into British hands as a trophy. With the frame too large and too firmly mounted to remove quickly, she reportedly ordered the canvas cut free instead. Historians have debated the exact details for 2 centuries, some crediting enslaved staff and aides with the physical act of the rescue rather than Dolley herself, but her role in insisting the painting be saved is widely accepted. She left the White House only hours before British soldiers arrived, carrying with her silver, velvet curtains and whatever documents could be gathered in the chaos. The image of a First Lady calmly organizing an evacuation, while an invading army closed in, has become one of the more enduring, if slightly romanticized, stories from that period. What's less discussed is what happened to everything she couldn't take, and to the frame that once held the painting she worked so hard to save. 3. The missing Washington portrait frame. When the portrait of George Washington was cut from its frame during the evacuation, The canvas survived, but the ornate frame itself was left behind in the burning building. It's a small detail, often overlooked, but it tells you something about the priorities of that chaotic night. The image mattered more than the object surrounding it. The frame, along with countless other furnishings, was destroyed when the fire consumed the interior hours later. For decades afterward, the rescued portrait became something of a symbolic artifact, proof that at least one piece of the nation's identity had survived the invasion intact. It now hangs in the East Room, the same room it was removed from in 1814, though the current frame is, of course, a replacement. Some historians have questioned how much of the rescue story was embellished over time to create a more dramatic narrative around Dolley Madison's actions, since much of what we know comes from her own letters written after the fact. Regardless of who physically removed the canvas, the White House kept the story alive for generations, using it as a quiet reminder of resilience. And speaking of what was lost that day, not everything the British took was destroyed. Quite a bit of it was simply carried away. 4. The 1814 looting. Before the White House was set on fire, British soldiers spent time going through it, taking whatever they found valuable enough to carry. Wine from the cellar, silverware, small furnishings. Some accounts describe soldiers pocketing souvenirs, items they apparently wanted as proof they had walked through the American president's home. There are stories difficult to fully verify, of items ending up in private British collections for generations afterward, passed down as curiosities from the night Washington burned. Food that had been prepared for a formal dinner Madison never got to eat was consumed by the invading soldiers before the destruction began, an oddly intimate detail amid an act of war. The looting wasn't isolated to the White House either. Other government buildings were stripped of documents and valuables before being burned as well. Some records suggest officers allowed a degree of looting as a way to boost morale among soldiers who had marched a long way to reach the capital. Whether this was official policy or simply undisciplined opportunism is still debated among historians studying the invasion. What's clear is that the psychological damage of watching the enemy calmly dine in the president's home before torching it left a lasting impression on the American public, one that shaped early ideas about national vulnerability. And not long after the fire was set, nature seemed to intervene in its own dramatic way. 5. The storm that ended the occupation. Shortly after British forces set fire to Washington, an intense storm rolled through the city, one severe enough that some accounts describe it as behaving almost like a tornado. Roofs were torn from buildings, winds reportedly overturned cannons. Rain fell hard enough to help extinguish parts of the fires still burning throughout the capital. Some British soldiers were killed when structures collapsed around them during the storm. Whatever the exact meteorological explanation, the timing struck many contemporaries as almost too perfect, a violent storm arriving just as the invading force needed to reconsider its position. British commanders, already wary of overextending themselves this deep into hostile territory, chose to withdraw from Washington shortly afterward. Some historians see the storm as simply a coincidence of weather patterns common to the region in late summer. Others, particularly at the time, viewed it as something closer to divine intervention, a nation's capital seemingly defended by forces beyond military control. Newspapers of the era leaned heavily into that interpretation, framing the storm as almost providential. Whether coincidence or convenient narrative, the retreat that followed allowed the American government to begin the slow process of returning to a capital that now needed to be rebuilt almost entirely from its foundations upward. And once reconstruction began, the choices made about how the building would look revealed something unexpected. 6. The original unpainted sandstone. When the White House was originally constructed in the 1790s, its exterior was built from pale gray sandstone, not the bright white finish most people picture today. That sandstone was porous, prone to absorbing moisture, which made it vulnerable to cracking during harsh winters. To protect the stone, workers applied a lime-based whitewash, a practical solution rather than a stylistic choice. After the 1814 fire, when the walls needed extensive repair, that same whitewash treatment was reapplied to help seal the scorched and damaged surface. Over time, the whitewash evolved into the more durable white lead paint we associate with the building now, and eventually the name White House shifted from casual nickname to official designation under Theodore Roosevelt in the early 1900s. It's a small detail, easy to overlook, that the most recognizable government building in the country wasn't originally meant to be white at all. It became white out of necessity, a practical fix to a structural problem that eventually became inseparable from the building's identity. Some historians find it fitting that a structure so tied to national image began as something far more utilitarian, its now iconic color the result of weatherproofing rather than any grand symbolic decision. And speaking of decisions made behind those freshly whitened walls, some of what happened next inside the White House would prove far stranger than anything caused by fire or storm. 7. The first white paint. Once the sandstone walls had been patched and repaired after the 1814 fire, the whitewash that had once been a simple protective measure became something more permanent. Workers replied layer after layer, not just to seal the porous stone, but to hide the scorch marks and discoloration left behind by the flames. Over the following decades, that whitewash was gradually replaced with white lead paint, a more durable coating that could withstand the region's humidity and cold winters far better than lime ever could. Some historians note that this ongoing maintenance is part of why the building's appearance became so fixed in the public imagination. Every few years, fresh coats were applied, and each one reinforced the idea that the White House had always looked this way, bright, clean, untouched by history. Of course it hadn't. Beneath those layers of paint were scars from a war, evidence carefully sealed away, rather than removed. It's a strange thought that the building's most iconic feature exists largely to conceal what happened to it. Preservationists today sometimes debate how much of the original sandstone texture still survives beneath centuries of paint, and how much has been lost entirely to decades of scraping and recoating. The whitewash that began as a practical fix slowly became inseparable from the building's identity, a quiet kind of camouflage that turned damage into tradition. And long before any of that paint was applied, the very construction of the building told a far more troubling story. 8. Enslaved labor at the president's house. Long before fire or paint ever touched the White House, its earliest stones were shaped by hands that had no choice in the matter. Historical records indicate that enslaved laborers were used extensively during the mansion's original construction in the 1790s, quarrying sandstone from nearby Aquia Creek, cutting timber and hauling materials across difficult terrain. Skilled enslaved workers, some historians argue, also contributed carpentry and brickwork, tasks requiring real expertise that went entirely uncredited at the time. The government didn't own these individuals directly in most cases. Instead, enslavers rented out their labor to contractors working on the federal project, collecting payment while the workers themselves received nothing. It's a detail that sits uneasily alongside the building's later symbolism as a house representing freedom and democratic government. For generations, this part of the story received little attention in official histories, mentioned briefly if at all. Only in more recent decades have historians and institutions begun examining the full scope of enslaved labor's role in constructing not just the White House, but the Capitol building as well. Some records remain incomplete, leaving exact numbers and names difficult to confirm even now. What is generally accepted is that the presidential residence, a building meant to project the ideals of a new nation, was built in part through forced, uncompensated labor. And the deeper researchers dig into old payroll ledgers, the more that uncomfortable reality comes into focus. 9. The hidden slave labor records, buried in old federal ledgers and commissioner correspondence from the 1790s, are payment records that quietly confirm what oral histories had long suggested. Government commissioners overseeing construction of the president's house paid enslavers directly for the labor of the people they held in bondage, a system that made the federal government a participant in slavery even while building its own executive residence. These documents list payments for labor without ever naming the individuals who performed it, reducing real people to line items in an accounting book. Some historians who have studied these records describe the arrangement as disturbingly routine, an unremarkable business transaction at the time rather than anything considered controversial. The workers themselves left almost no personal record of their experience, no letters, no named accounts, just the faint trace of their labor preserved in someone else's financial paperwork. Researchers have spent years trying to piece together fragments, cross-referencing plantation records with construction timelines, in hopes of recovering even partial identities. Progress has been slow, and much likely will never be fully recovered. It's a quiet kind of erasure, One that happened not through violence but through omission, through records that simply never thought these individuals worth naming. In recent years, efforts have been made to formally acknowledge this history within the White House's own historical materials. Whether that acknowledgement can ever be considered sufficient remains, understandably, a matter of ongoing discussion. And while the building's origins carried this quiet weight, its interior would later become the site of far more personal, sudden loss. 10. The first death in the White House. In 1841, President William Henry Harrison became the first president to die in office, and the first person to die inside the White House itself. He had delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, nearly 2 hours in cold, wet weather without a coat, according to popular accounts. Whether that speech directly caused his fatal illness is debated among historians, since he didn't fall seriously ill until weeks later, but the story stuck regardless. Harrison developed symptoms consistent with pneumonia, and over the following days his condition steadily worsened inside the White House walls. He died just 31 days after taking office, the shortest presidential term in American history. His sudden death threw the young government into confusion. There was no clear constitutional precedent for what should happen next, whether the vice president would simply assume presidential duties or hold some lesser interim role. Vice President John Tyler ultimately asserted that he was president in full, not merely an acting one, setting a precedent that shaped succession for generations afterward. Meanwhile, the White House itself briefly became the site of a very public funeral, mourners filing through halls that had, until then, mostly hosted policy meetings and social functions. The building had weathered fire and construction and quiet historical omissions. Now it had witnessed its first death, a moment that changed how Americans understood what could happen inside those walls. And that final illness, it turns out, was its own strange and uncertain ordeal. 11. Harrison's deathbed struggle. As Harrison's condition deteriorated, the White House transformed almost overnight from a place of ceremony into something closer to a sick room under quiet siege. Physicians attempted various treatments common to the era, including opium, castor oil, and even leeches, methods that, by modern medical understanding, likely worsened his condition rather than helping it. Cabinet members reportedly moved in and out of his chambers, uncertain how to proceed, since the Constitution offered little clarity on what should happen if a president became incapacitated or died. Behind the scenes, tension grew over who truly held authority, while Harrison lingered. Some officials apparently believed the cabinet should collectively govern until a new election could be arranged, a notion Vice President Tyler firmly rejected once Harrison passed. Historians still debate how influenced Harrison's final days were by the medical practices of the time, with some suggesting his treatment may have hastened his death rather than easing his suffering. Whatever the exact cause, his final hours were spent within a building still relatively new to hosting this kind of quiet crisis. Word spread slowly through Washington as Harrison's condition worsened, and by the time he died, the nation found itself facing a political question it had never truly answered. What happens when a president dies in office? The White House had already survived fire and construction controversy. Now it held the answer to a question that would shape the presidency for the next 2 centuries. And decades later, another death within those same walls would carry a very different, deeply personal kind of grief. 12. Lincoln's son Willie died there. In February of 1862, 11-year-old Willie Lincoln, considered by many who knew him to be a bright and gentle child, died in the White House after a battle with typhoid fever, likely contracted from contaminated water supplying the building at the time. His death came in the middle of the Civil War, a period already heavy with national grief, but this loss was intensely personal for President Lincoln and his wife Mary. Willie had been sick for weeks, and reports describe Lincoln visiting his son's room repeatedly between meetings, trying to balance the demands of a nation at war with the quiet devastation unfolding upstairs. When Willie died, Mary Lincoln reportedly could not bring herself to attend the funeral held inside the White House. Her grief was so overwhelming. Some accounts suggest she never fully recovered from the loss, turning increasingly toward spiritualism in the years that followed, hoping to somehow reach her son again. Lincoln himself was said to have visited Willie's embalmed body more than once in the days after his death, unable to fully accept it. The White House, a building already marked by fire, forced labor, and a president's death, now held this quieter, more intimate kind of sorrow within its walls. It's a reminder that beneath the weight of politics and history, it was also simply a family's home, one capable of holding both a nation's business and its own private grief within the very same rooms. 13. The Lincoln Seances. After Willie's death, Mary Lincoln's grief pulled her towards something the White House had never really hosted before: formal spiritualist sessions held within its walls. She reportedly invited mediums into the residence, hoping to make contact with her son on the other side, a practice far more common in Victorian America than modern audiences might assume. Death, especially of children, touched nearly every household during that era, and spiritualism offered grieving families a fragile promise of connection that traditional mourning rituals couldn't quite provide. Some accounts suggest President Lincoln attended at least one of these sessions himself, though historians disagree on how seriously he took the experience compared to his wife's genuine belief in it. Whether anything otherworldly actually occurred during these gatherings is understandably impossible to verify. What is documented is the very real toll grief took on Mary Lincoln in the years that followed, a sorrow that friends and staff noted seemed to deepen rather than ease over time. The seances weren't unique to the Lincolns particularly, but their presence inside the executive mansion added a strange, quiet chapter to a home already carrying so much loss. And Mary wasn't the only Lincoln said to have brushed up against something unexplainable in those final years. 14. Abraham Lincoln's premonition dream. According to accounts shared by those close to him, Lincoln described a dream in the days before his assassination that unsettled him deeply enough to mention it to friends. In the dream, he reportedly wandered through the White House and came upon a room where mourners had gathered around a covered body. When he asked who had died, he was told, according to the story, that the president had been killed. Lincoln relayed this account to his wife and to his friend Ward Hill Lamon, who later wrote about it in his own recollections, though the story only became widely known after Lincoln's death, which naturally invites some skepticism about how precisely it was remembered, or perhaps embellished over time. Historians remain divided on how much weight to give the tale, since it survives mainly through second-hand retellings rather than any writing from Lincoln himself. Still, the story has persisted for well over a century, often repeated as one of the eerier footnotes to his final days. Whether it reflects a genuine premonition, ordinary anxiety given the tensions of wartime Washington, or simply a story shaped by hindsight, it remains one of the more haunting pieces of White House folklore. And the room said to house Lincoln's memory today isn't quite what most visitors assume it to be. 15. The Lincoln Bedroom misnomer. Despite its name, the Lincoln Bedroom was never actually where Abraham Lincoln slept. During his presidency, the room served as his office and cabinet meeting space, the place where he signed the Emancipation Proclamation and met with military advisors during the darkest years of the Civil War. Lincoln's actual bedroom was located elsewhere in the residence, a detail that surprises many people learning about the White House's layout for the first time. The room only became known as the Lincoln Bedroom decades later, after later administrations redecorated it using furniture associated with his presidency, including a bed Lincoln never actually slept in, though it had belonged to the family and was used elsewhere in the house. Over time, public memory simply attached itself to the name, and the association became permanent, regardless of the historical inaccuracy. Some staff members and guests over the years have described an unusual atmosphere in the room, feelings of unease or the sense of being watched, though these remain personal impressions rather than anything documented or verified. The mismatch between the room's name and its actual history is a small reminder of how easily legend can settle over fact once enough time passes. And just as memory reshaped that room, grief itself would soon reshape the entire building. 16. The White House mourning drapery. After Lincoln's assassination in 1865, the White House was transformed almost overnight into a space of formal, visible mourning. Black crepe fabric was draped across doorways, windows, and the East Room itself, where Lincoln's body lay in state before the public funeral procession. Mirrors throughout the building were reportedly covered, following mourning customs of the period that discouraged reflections during a household's period of grief. The scale of the decoration reflected not just personal loss but national shock, the first presidential assassination in the country's history, unfolding just days after the Civil War's end. Thousands of mourners filed past Lincoln's casket in the East Room, the same space that had hosted receptions and celebrations in more ordinary times. Descriptions from witnesses at the time note the strange silence that filled hallways, usually alive with political conversation and social gatherings. The mourning decorations remained in place for an extended period, a visible reminder that the building could hold celebration and devastation within the very same walls, sometimes only weeks apart. Once the drapery finally came down, the presidency itself faced an entirely different kind of storm, one rooted not in grief but in political conflict. 17. Andrew Johnson's impeachment meetings. Following Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency during one of the most politically hostile periods the White House has ever witnessed. Johnson clashed repeatedly with Congress over reconstruction policy, and by 1868 tensions escalated to the point where the House formally impeached him, the first time such an action had ever been taken against a sitting president. Much of the political maneuvering, private strategy sessions, and tense negotiations reportedly took place within the White House itself, transforming the building into something closer to a political battleground than a peaceful executive residence. Johnson remained in office throughout the process, continuing to govern from the same halls where his removal was actively being debated, an unusual and deeply uncomfortable arrangement by any historical standard. The Senate ultimately fell one vote short of convicting him, allowing him to finish his term, though his presidency remained defined by conflict from that point forward. Staff members at the time reportedly described an atmosphere of constant tension, uncertain whispers about what might happen next, and a White House that felt more like contested territory than a stable seat of government. It was a strange chapter in the building's history, proof that political turmoil could settle into these rooms just as easily as grief once had. And while lawmakers argued openly in formal chambers, an entirely different kind of movement was happening quietly out of sight. 18. The secretive back staircases. Tucked behind the White House's grand public rooms are narrow service staircases, built specifically to allow household staff to move between floors without being seen by guests, dignitaries, or the first family themselves. These passageways reflect a broader design philosophy common in grand residences of the era, the idea that a home's labor should remain, quite literally, out of sight. Butlers, maids, and kitchen staff relied on these hidden routes to carry meals, linens, and messages throughout the building, appearing and disappearing almost invisibly around the edges of official life. Over the decades, these staircases became something like the building's circulatory system, allowing the White House to function smoothly while maintaining the illusion of effortless elegance in its public spaces. Some historians note that this hidden architecture also reflects the social hierarchies of earlier eras, where household labor was expected to remain unseen and unacknowledged, even while being entirely essential. Staff members who worked within these narrow halls over the years have described a strange intimacy with the building unavailable to any official visitor, catching fragments of private conversations, historic arguments, and quiet family moments never meant for public record. In many ways, these staircases hold their own untold history, layered quietly behind the walls of a house that has always been far more complicated than its bright, polished exterior suggests. 19. The White House basement. Beneath the polished floors and formal reception rooms lies a much less glamorous version of the White House, one that few visitors ever consider. The basement level has quietly housed kitchens, storage rooms, laundry facilities, and mechanical systems since the earliest days of the residence, evolving alongside the building's changing needs. Over the decades, it also became home to staff workspaces, tucked away from the eyes of guests and dignitaries upstairs, much like the hidden staircases woven through the walls above. As the 20th century progressed, portions of the basement level were adapted for secure functions, reflecting a presidency that increasingly required space for communications equipment and protective infrastructure rather than simply food storage. It's a part of the house rarely photographed or discussed, yet it has quietly supported everything happening above it for generations. In many ways, the basement tells its own version of White House history, one measured not in famous speeches or state dinners, but in plumbing lines, delivery entrances, and the unglamorous machinery of daily life. And by the middle of the 20th century, what was happening beneath those floors would matter more than anyone expected. 20. The Truman reconstruction. By 1948, the White House had quietly become something close to a hazard. Structural engineers called in to investigate creaking floors and shifting furniture discovered that the building's wooden support beams had deteriorated far beyond safe limits, weakened by decades of unauthorized modifications, added plumbing, and simple old age. One report reportedly warned that the second floor was in danger of collapsing into the staterooms below, an alarming possibility for a house actively occupied by the president and his family. President Truman and his family were relocated across the street to Blair House, while engineers assessed the full scope of the damage. What they found was worse than anyone anticipated. The interior had essentially been patched together for over a century, load-bearing walls compromised, ceilings sagging, and staircases no longer considered structurally sound. The solution wasn't a simple repair. It required an almost complete rebuilding of the interior structure, a project far larger than most Americans realized was happening just blocks from the Capitol. And what workers ultimately did to fix it left almost nothing of the original interior standing. 21. The hollowed-out mansion. To address the structural crisis, workers didn't simply repair the interior of the White House, they removed it entirely. Between 1949 and 1952, crews dismantled nearly every interior wall, floor, and support beam within the historic structure, leaving only the original exterior sandstone walls standing as a kind of empty shell. Photographs from the period show heavy machinery operating inside what looks more like a demolition site than a presidential residence, with steel beams and concrete replacing the aging wood framework beneath. Architectural details, moldings, mantels, and historic woodwork were carefully cataloged and later reinstalled to preserve the building's traditional appearance, even though the underlying structure was now entirely modern. In essence, the White House Americans see today is a mid-century steel frame building, wearing the carefully reconstructed face of its 19th century predecessor. Truman himself took a personal interest in documenting the renovation, later publishing photographs of the gutted interior to show the public just how close the building had come to catastrophe. And once the rebuilding neared completion, Truman added one particular architectural touch that didn't sit well with everyone. 22. Truman's balcony controversy. As part of the broader renovation, Truman approved the addition of a second-floor balcony on the south portico, a space intended to give the first family a private outdoor area overlooking the south lawn. While practical, the addition sparked immediate criticism from architectural preservationists who argued that it disrupted the clean, classical lines of the building's historic facade. Some critics called it an unnecessary modern intrusion on a design meant to remain visually unchanged. Newspapers of the era debated the merits of the addition at length, with some architects insisting it damaged the integrity of the mansion's original design. Truman, characteristically unbothered by the criticism, defended the balcony as a practical improvement for a working family living in an increasingly modern age. Over time, public opinion softened, and the balcony eventually became such a familiar part of the White House silhouette that most Americans today would struggle to imagine the building without it. What was once considered a controversial disruption is now simply accepted as tradition. And Truman's renovation wasn't the first time a president reshaped the building's identity through construction. 23. The 1902 Roosevelt renovation. Decades earlier, President Theodore Roosevelt initiated his own major transformation of the White House, driven partly by necessity and partly by his famously energetic personality. By the turn of the century, the mansion had become cluttered with Victorian-era additions, ornate furnishings, and cramped office space that no longer suited the demands of a modern presidency. Roosevelt, along with his large and rambunctious family, found the arrangement impractical for both daily living and official business. His solution was to relocate presidential offices entirely, constructing a new, dedicated executive office building attached to the residence, which became known as the West Wing. This allowed the main house to return to its original purpose as a family residence rather than a combined home and workplace. The renovation also involved stripping away decades of accumulated Victorian ornamentation in favor of a cleaner, more classical aesthetic intended to reflect the building's original architectural vision. It was a significant shift in how the presidency physically operated day to day. And in clearing space for this new vision, Roosevelt's renovation swept away one particular feature almost entirely. 24. The demolished conservatories. Long before Roosevelt's renovation, the White House grounds had featured elaborate glass conservatories, greenhouse structures filled with exotic plants, flowers, and decorative greenery that stretched across much of the building's western side. These conservatories had been expanded gradually over several administrations, eventually becoming a sprawling architectural feature nearly as large as the residence itself. Visitors often admired them as a lush, almost tropical contrast to the formal stone exterior of the mansion. But as part of his 1902 renovation, Roosevelt ordered the conservatories torn down entirely to make room for the new West Wing office space. Preservationists at the time expressed regret over losing such a distinctive architectural feature, but Roosevelt viewed the greenhouses as an impractical relic that no longer served the needs of a modern presidency. Once demolished, the space was permanently repurposed for executive offices, forever changing the layout and function of the western grounds. Few visitors today walking past the West Wing ever realize that greenhouses full of orchids and tropical plants once stood in that exact location, quietly erased to make room for the machinery of modern governance. 25. The original West Wing fire. Just over 2 decades after Roosevelt's West Wing was completed, disaster struck the very offices he'd built to modernize the presidency. On Christmas Eve in 1929, an electrical fire broke out in the West Wing, while President Herbert Hoover was hosting guests inside the main residence. The blaze spread quickly through the wooden interior, fueled by decades-old wiring never designed for the growing electrical demands of a modern executive office. Staff scrambled to save documents and furniture as firefighters worked to contain the flames before they could reach the residence itself. Hoover reportedly left a White House reception to personally direct efforts outside as smoke poured from the building. The fire gutted much of the West Wing's interior, destroying offices, records, and years of accumulated paperwork. In the aftermath, Hoover's staff were forced to relocate temporarily while repairs were made, conducting the business of the presidency from borrowed spaces across the White House complex. It was a stark reminder that even the most modern additions to the White House were still vulnerable to old-fashioned hazards. And the damage from that fire didn't stop at the office walls. It crept closer to the heart of presidential power than most people realized. 26. The Oval Office fire damage. As the 1929 fire spread through the West Wing, it moved dangerously close to the Oval Office itself, threatening to consume the very space where major decisions of the Hoover administration were made. Firefighters worked through the night in freezing temperatures, pouring water onto the flames while trying to prevent the fire from reaching the mansion's historic core. Reports from the time describe smoke damage extending into areas immediately surrounding the office, along with the loss of furnishings and documents kept nearby. Ultimately, the firefighters succeeded in containing the blaze before it could spread into the residence proper, sparing the historic structure from a far greater catastrophe. Still, the Oval Office itself required extensive repairs and refurbishment once the smoke cleared, and Hoover's staff had to work around the damage for weeks afterward. The incident quietly underscored just how fragile the modern presidency's physical infrastructure really was, tucked as it was into wooden additions built for convenience rather than resilience. It would take another president, with an entirely different vision, to reshape that space into something more permanent. 27. The West Wing's secret expansion. Following the 1929 fire, it fell to Franklin Roosevelt to rebuild and rethink the West Wing entirely once he took office in 1933. Roosevelt, who required specially adapted spaces due to his mobility challenges, oversaw a significant expansion and reorganization of the executive offices, aiming for something more functional and enduring. It was during this renovation that the Oval Office was relocated to its now familiar position at the southeast corner of the West Wing, offering direct views of the Rose Garden. Roosevelt worked closely with architects to ensure the new layout suited both his physical needs and the demands of a rapidly growing federal government. The expansion added additional office space, improved wiring systems, and structural updates meant to prevent a repeat of Hoover's fire disaster. Few Americans at the time realized just how much of the West Wing they recognize today was quietly shaped by Roosevelt's practical, almost invisible renovations. What looks like a timeless architectural fixture is really the product of necessity, disaster, and one president's determination to make the space work for him. And decades later, another hidden addition would take shape far beneath that very complex. 28. The Presidential Bunker. Deep beneath the East Wing lies a facility most Americans only became aware of decades after its construction, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Built during the Cold War era, this underground bunker was designed to shelter the president and key officials in the event of a national emergency or nuclear attack. Its existence was kept quiet for years, with only vague references appearing in government documents and the occasional leaked detail. The facility reportedly includes reinforced walls, independent power and communication systems, and secure meeting spaces built to withstand serious external threats. Details about its full capabilities remain classified, and much of what the public knows comes from indirect government acknowledgments rather than official disclosures. It stands as a quiet symbol of an era defined by existential fear, a hidden layer of the White House built not for ceremony or comfort, but survival. And its purpose became strikingly real on one particular morning in September of 2001. 29. The September 11 evacuation. On the morning of September 11, 2001, as the scale of the attacks became clear, Secret Service agents moved quickly to secure the White House complex and its senior officials. Vice President Dick Cheney was reportedly escorted to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center beneath the East Wing, where he remained as officials worked to understand the unfolding crisis. From that secure location, Cheney was involved in critical communications and decisions during those chaotic early hours, according to later accounts. The bunker's existence, long a quiet rumor, suddenly became a matter of public record as journalists and historians pieced together the day's events. For many Americans, it was the first confirmation that such a facility existed at all beneath the White House grounds. The events of that day transformed the Emergency Operations Center from an obscure Cold War relic into a recognized, if still mysterious, part of presidential security infrastructure. And the bunker itself, it turns out, isn't the only hidden passage connecting the complex. 30. The tunnel network, beyond the Emergency Operations Center. Rumors and limited official acknowledgments suggest a network of secure tunnels connecting various points within the White House complex. These passageways are believed to link the Residence, West Wing, and Treasury Building, allowing for discreet movement during emergencies or high-security situations. The full extent of this tunnel system has never been publicly disclosed, and officials have historically declined to confirm specific details, citing security concerns. Some historians believe portions of the network date back to earlier security upgrades made during the Cold War, while other sections may be more recent additions. What little is known comes largely from indirect references in declassified documents or brief mentions during security assessments over the years. The White House, it seems, holds not just centuries of political history within its walls, but an entire hidden architecture beneath them, built quietly, deliberately, and largely out of public view. 31. The hidden bowling alley. Beneath the north portico, tucked away from public tours and rarely mentioned in official White House literature, sits a single-lane bowling alley installed during the Nixon administration. The idea reportedly came from a group of Nixon supporters who wanted to give the president a private place to relax after long days of work. Construction took place quietly in the early 1970s, adding one more unexpected feature to a building already filled with hidden rooms and secret passages. Nixon himself wasn't known to be much of a bowler, and some accounts suggest he rarely used the lane at all. Still, the alley remained part of the White House complex long after his presidency ended, occasionally used by staff and later administrations looking for a break from the pressures of the job. It's a strange little detail, a bowling alley existing just steps away from historic offices and formal staterooms. And it's far from the only recreational surprise hidden within these walls, because decades earlier, another president had already built something even more ambitious for his own private use. 32. The White House swimming pool. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt had an indoor swimming pool built within the White House, largely for therapeutic reasons related to his struggle with polio. Swimming offered him relief and mobility that walking could not, and the pool became an important part of his daily routine throughout his presidency. Funded partly through public donations, the pool was seen as both a practical necessity and a quiet acknowledgement of Roosevelt's physical challenges, something rarely discussed openly at the time. For years, it remained a functioning part of the West Wing, used by Roosevelt and later by subsequent presidents for exercise and relaxation. But eventually, as White House needs shifted toward media and communication, the pool's purpose changed entirely. Its story didn't end with draining and demolition. Instead, it evolved into something else entirely, quietly transformed to serve a very different, very public function that reporters would come to know well. 33. The press room's watery past. By the early 1970s, the Nixon administration decided the White House needed a dedicated space for press briefings, and rather than constructing something new, officials chose a practical solution. They built directly over Roosevelt's old swimming pool, creating what is now known as the James S. Brady Press Briefing Room. The pool itself wasn't entirely removed. Portions of it are believed to remain beneath the reinforced flooring, hidden beneath cameras, podiums, and the daily exchanges between press secretaries and reporters. It's a curious bit of layered history. A therapeutic pool built for a president struggling with illness eventually became a stage for political messaging and media scrutiny decades later. Few visitors or journalists standing in that room today likely think about the water once flowing beneath their feet. It's one of those quiet architectural transformations that reveals how the White House constantly repurposes its past to meet the practical demands of the present, layering new function directly on top of old history. 34. The White House Movie Theater. Long before it became a private screening room for presidents and their families, the space now known as the White House Theater served a far less glamorous purpose as a simple cloakroom. Over time, as film became a popular form of entertainment and relaxation, the room was converted into a small theater capable of hosting private screenings for the first family and their guests. Presidents from Truman onward have used the space to watch films, sometimes newly released movies before they hit theaters nationwide. It's also occasionally used for briefings and special presentations, blending entertainment with the practical needs of the presidency. The theater remains one of the more low-key luxuries within the White House, a quiet reminder that even amid the pressures of governing a nation, there's still room for an evening of relaxation. And while movies offered one form of quiet White House tradition, an entirely different group works tirelessly behind the scenes to maintain another, one rooted in precision and old-fashioned craftsmanship. 35. The Secret Calligraphers, tucked away within the White House complex, is a small, specialized office dedicated entirely to calligraphy. Skilled calligraphers are responsible for handwriting formal invitations, official proclamations, and certificates using traditional pen and ink techniques. Every state dinner invitation, diplomatic correspondence, and award citation that requires an elegant, formal touch passes through their careful hands. It's a tradition that dates back generations, preserved even as most of the world shifted toward digital printing and automated design. These calligraphers train for years to master various historic scripts, ensuring that official White House documents maintain a level of craftsmanship rarely seen elsewhere in modern government. Their work often goes unnoticed by the public, quietly shaping the visual identity of presidential communications behind the scenes. It's a small but fascinating example of how the White House balances centuries-old tradition with the practical demands of modern governance, one carefully inked letter at a time. 36. The White House Flower Shop. Just as calligraphers quietly shape the visual elegance of official documents, another dedicated team works behind the scenes to shape the atmosphere of the White House itself. A fully staffed flower shop operates within the complex, responsible for creating floral arrangements for state dinners, ceremonies, memorials, and everyday use throughout the building's many rooms. This team works closely with the first family to select flowers that reflect the tone of each occasion, from joyful celebrations to solemn memorial services. Arrangements are often changed daily, ensuring that public and private spaces alike maintain a fresh, carefully curated appearance at all times. The flower shop also plays a role during holidays, contributing to the elaborate seasonal decorations seen throughout the residence each December. It's a quiet, easily overlooked department, yet its work subtly shapes the emotional tone of countless White House events. Behind the marble columns and historic architecture, it seems, there's always another quiet team working carefully to shape the experience within. 37. The Underground Chocolate Shop. Deep within the White House kitchens operates a fully equipped pastry shop capable of producing extraordinary works of edible art. Executive pastry chefs have created chocolate sculptures of the White House itself, towering sugar showpieces for state dinners, and elaborate gingerbread replicas of the building each holiday season. Some of these creations take weeks to complete, requiring teams of chefs working with chocolate, sugar, and marzipan the way sculptors might work with clay. The pastry kitchen has produced everything from delicate dessert displays for foreign dignitaries to massive candy creations for televised holiday tours. It's a surprisingly artistic corner of an otherwise buttoned-up government building, one where creativity is allowed to shine in ways rarely associated with official Washington. Few visitors realize just how much skill and imagination goes into a single dessert course served at a state dinner. And while sweetness fills one part of the kitchen, the broader food operation surrounding it operates under a very different kind of scrutiny, one focused less on flavor and far more on safety. 38. The presidential kitchen's strict security. Preparing meals for the president isn't simply a matter of culinary skill, it's a matter of national security. Every ingredient that enters the White House kitchen is carefully tracked, inspected, and verified before it ever reaches a cutting board. Deliveries are scheduled and monitored closely, and kitchen staff undergo extensive background checks before they're ever allowed near presidential meals. Some ingredients are tested before preparation, and food is often prepared under direct supervision to guard against contamination or tampering. This level of caution isn't paranoia. It's a practical response to very real historical concerns about poisoning and sabotage that have shadowed world leaders for centuries. Even something as simple as a dinner salad involves layers of protocol most people would never imagine exist. It's a quiet reminder that in the White House, even the most ordinary daily routines carry an undercurrent of extraordinary vigilance. And that same vigilance extends far beyond the kitchen, into an entirely separate operation built specifically to protect the health of everyone living and working within these walls. 39. The White House Medical Unit, tucked away within the complex, is a fully staffed medical office, known as the White House Medical Unit, responsible for the health and safety of the president, the first family, staff, and visiting guests. This unit operates around the clock, prepared for everything from minor injuries to serious medical emergencies. It's staffed by physicians, nurses, and support personnel, often drawn from military medical corps, ensuring immediate care is always available no matter the hour. During large public events, the unit coordinates closely with the Secret Service, ready to respond instantly if something goes wrong. The office also manages the president's ongoing health needs, coordinating checkups, medications, and specialist consultations far from public view. It's a quiet, essential operation that rarely makes headlines, yet it functions as a critical safety net behind nearly every presidential appearance. Of course, medical readiness is only one layer of protection surrounding the presidency, and the origins of that broader protective system trace back to a purpose most people would never expect. 40. The Secret Service's origins. Most people assume the Secret Service has always existed to protect presidents, but that's not actually where the story begins. The agency was created in 1865, not to guard the president, but to combat the widespread problem of counterfeit currency following the Civil War. At the time, it's estimated that roughly a third of all circulating currency in the United States was fake, threatening the young nation's already fragile economy. The Secret Service was formed under the Treasury Department specifically to track down counterfeiters and stabilize the financial system. Presidential protection wasn't part of its original mission at all. In fact, for decades, presidents moved through public spaces with shockingly little formal security, a gap that seems almost unimaginable today. It would take a series of tragic events before the government fully recognized that protecting the nation's currency and protecting its president were two very different responsibilities, requiring very different solutions. 41. McKinley's delayed protection. Despite earlier assassinations of Lincoln and Garfield, formal permanent Secret Service protection for presidents still didn't exist by the turn of the 20th century. That changed only after President William McKinley was shot in 1901 while greeting the public at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He died from his wounds just over a week later, becoming the third American president assassinated in less than 40 years. The shock of another presidential murder finally pushed Congress to act. Shortly afterward, the Secret Service was formally assigned the responsibility of protecting the president full-time, a duty that has continued uninterrupted ever since. It's a sobering reminder that many of the security measures we now take for granted were built not through foresight, but through tragedy. Each assassination forced institutions to catch up to dangers that had already become painfully clear. And as threats to the presidency evolved over the following decades, so too did the tactics and technology used to prevent them. 42. The White House snipers. As protective methods advanced throughout the 20th century, the Secret Service developed specialized counter-sniper teams, often visible on White House rooftops during major public events. These highly trained units are equipped to detect and neutralize long-range threats, scanning surrounding areas with precision optics and constant vigilance. Their presence became especially prominent following increased security concerns during the Cold War and later after various assassination attempts targeting American presidents. While rarely acknowledged publicly in detail, these teams remain a quiet but constant feature of presidential security whenever the president appears outdoors. Their training emphasizes patience and restraint as much as marksmanship, since split-second decisions carry enormous consequences. It's a stark contrast to the quiet elegance of chocolate sculptures and calligraphed invitations we explored earlier, yet it exists within the very same walls. Together, these details reveal a White House that is at once a home, a workplace, a museum, and one of the most carefully guarded buildings on Earth. 43. The rooftop security posts. Beyond the counter-sniper teams themselves, the White House maintains a broader network of rooftop security positions that become especially active during major public events and presidential arrivals or departures. Armed protective personnel are stationed at strategic points across the complex, often unseen by the public below, scanning crowds, streets, and surrounding buildings for anything out of place. These posts work in constant communication with agents on the ground, creating layers of overlapping coverage that most visitors never notice. The goal isn't just to react to threats, but to prevent them entirely through visible deterrence and quiet observation. Weather rarely matters here. Rain, wind, or scorching summer heat, these positions remain staffed whenever the president is present. It's a level of readiness built from decades of hard lessons, each one reinforcing the idea that safety cannot be left to chance. And while rooftop vigilance guards against threats from people, not every danger the White House has faced has come from someone with intent to harm. Sometimes the danger came from mechanical failure, arriving suddenly and without warning, right on the White House's own front lawn.
44.
The 1974 White House helicopter crash. In February 1974, a routine flight turned into a genuine emergency when an Army helicopter experienced a serious mechanical malfunction while approaching the White House grounds. The aircraft went down on the South Lawn, an area normally reserved for ceremonial arrivals and quiet strolls, not sudden aviation accidents. Emergency crews responded immediately, and the crew aboard suffered injuries in the crash, though thankfully no one on the ground was harmed. The incident raised immediate questions about flight safety protocols so close to the presidential residence, an area meant to be among the most controlled airspace in the country. Investigations followed, examining how such a malfunction could occur during a routine approach to one of the most sensitive locations in America. The crash served as an unusual reminder that threats to the White House weren't always deliberate. Sometimes they came from equipment failure, rather than any hostile intent at all. It pushed officials to reconsider air traffic procedures near the complex, tightening protocols that remain in place today. And while this particular incident stemmed from mechanical trouble, 2 decades later, a very different kind of danger would test the White House's defenses. This time, the threat came not from the sky above, but from the street just beyond its gates. 45. The 1994 White House shooting. In October 1994, a man opened fire on the White House from the sidewalk along Pennsylvania Avenue, spraying dozens of rounds toward the building before he was eventually subdued by bystanders and law enforcement. The gunfire struck the exterior of the White House itself, leaving visible damage and sending Secret Service agents scrambling to secure the area and confirm the safety of everyone inside. Remarkably, no one was injured during the incident, though the sheer volume of gunfire fired at the presidential residence sent shockwaves through the security community. The shooter was later found to have a history of mental illness and had reportedly expressed intentions of targeting the president directly. The event prompted an immediate reassessment of perimeter security, visibility along the fence line, and response times for incidents originating from public streets surrounding the complex. It became one of several cases studied closely by security officials looking to close gaps between public access and presidential protection. The White House, despite its heavy security presence, remained vulnerable to threats arriving suddenly from ordinary public spaces just outside its gates. And unfortunately, gunfire aimed at the White House wouldn't remain a rare occurrence confined to the 1990s alone. 46. The 2011 White House shooting. In November 2011, gunfire once again struck the White House, though this time the danger wasn't immediately recognized. A man fired multiple rounds from a semi-automatic rifle toward the building from a nearby vehicle, before fleeing the scene. Remarkably, it took several days before Secret Service agents discovered that bullets had actually struck the residence, lodging in a window and exterior stonework near living quarters used by the Obama family. The delay in identifying the damage raised serious concerns about the White House's ability to detect and respond to attacks in real time. Investigations later revealed gaps in communication and oversight that allowed the incident to go unnoticed for far too long. The shooter was eventually identified, arrested, and convicted for the attack. The event triggered internal reviews of Secret Service procedures, exposing weaknesses that many officials found deeply troubling given the stakes involved. It served as a wake-up call, prompting updated technology and protocols meant to identify threats immediately rather than after the fact. And while this incident revealed flaws in detection, just a few years later, another security failure would expose an even more direct vulnerability, one involving the White House fence itself. 47. The 2014 fence jumper. In September 2014, a man scaled the White House perimeter fence and managed to sprint across the north lawn, entering through the front door before finally being apprehended deep inside the building. He made it startlingly far, past the entrance, through the foyer, and into the East Room before Secret Service agents finally stopped him. The incident exposed alarming gaps in the White House's physical security, especially considering how far the intruder traveled before encountering serious resistance. Investigations later revealed that alarm systems had reportedly been muted in certain areas, and that established security protocols weren't properly followed during the incident. The fallout led to congressional hearings, resignations within Secret Service leadership, and a broader public reckoning over how such a breach could happen at one of the most heavily guarded buildings in the world. Additional security measures were quickly implemented, including reinforced fencing and revised emergency response training. The event remains one of the most significant security failures in modern White House history, a stark reminder that even legendary protective systems can fail under ordinary human error. And while that breach came from someone entering the grounds, a very different kind of security concern would unfold years later, this time originating from outside the fence entirely. 48. The 2020 Lafayette Square bunker trip. In late May 2020, as protests intensified near the White House following the death of George Floyd, reports emerged that President Trump had briefly been moved to the underground Presidential Emergency Operations Center as a security precaution. The bunker, built for extreme scenarios like nuclear attacks or large-scale threats, isn't typically used for civil unrest occurring just beyond the property line. News of the move sparked intense public debate, with some officials downplaying its significance and others suggesting it reflected genuine concern among the Secret Service about crowd size and proximity. The White House later confirmed the visit had occurred, though details about its exact duration and purpose remained limited. The incident became a flashpoint in broader conversations about presidential security decisions during periods of civil unrest. It also highlighted just how quickly ordinary protective protocols can escalate when protests draw near one of the most symbolically significant buildings in the country. Whether viewed as a necessary precaution or an overreaction, the event underscored how unpredictable modern security challenges have become, no longer limited to lone gunmen or fence jumpers, but shaped by rapidly shifting political and social tensions unfolding right outside the gates. 49. The blackout windows. Long after the days of fence jumpers and gunfire, the White House quietly incorporated another layer of protection, one built directly into its architecture. Certain windows throughout the residence are fitted with specialized glass and covering systems designed to reduce the risks posed by surveillance, sniper fire, and other external threats. These aren't your average curtains. Some incorporate ballistic-resistant materials, while others use technology intended to block infrared scanning or long-range listening devices. The exact specifications remain closely guarded, as revealing too much would defeat the purpose entirely. Officials have never confirmed precisely which windows are treated this way, leaving the public to speculate about just how much of the building's exterior appearance conceals hidden defenses. It's a subtle reminder that even something as ordinary looking as a window pane can serve a much larger purpose within the world's most protected home. The blend of historic architecture with modern security technology shows just how far the White House has evolved from its original design. And while windows guard against threats from outside, not every hidden secret involves danger. Some quieter White House traditions involve much gentler creatures buried right beneath the surface of its historic lawns. 50. The North Lawn Burials. Beneath the manicured lawns and carefully trimmed hedges of the White House grounds lies a quieter kind of history, one involving beloved animals rather than presidents or policy. Historical accounts suggest that over the decades, various presidential pets were laid to rest somewhere on the property after their deaths. Their final resting place is rarely marked or publicized. Given how many pets have called the White House home over the centuries, dogs, cats, horses, and even more unusual creatures, it wouldn't be surprising if the grounds hold more than just decorative gardens. No official public records detail exact burial locations, and most of these stories remain part of oral tradition passed down through staff and caretakers rather than documented history. Still, the idea persists that beneath those perfectly kept lawns rest small, quiet tributes to animals that once brought comfort to the families living there. It adds an unexpectedly tender layer to a building otherwise associated with power and politics. And speaking of presidential pets with far more colorful stories than a quiet burial, one early resident of the White House kept a companion that would raise eyebrows in any era. 51. John Quincy Adams's alligator. According to popular historical accounts, President John Quincy Adams once kept an alligator inside the White House, reportedly housed in an unused bathroom for several months. The story goes that the reptile was a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette during his visit to the United States, and rather than declining such an unusual present, Adams decided to keep it. Visitors were apparently invited to view the alligator, turning it into something of a novelty attraction within the presidential residence. While the tale has been repeated for generations, historians note that documentation from the era is limited, leaving some uncertainty about exactly how long the alligator stayed or how it eventually left. True or exaggerated over time, the story reflects just how differently early presidents approached formality and decorum compared to today's standards. It's hard to imagine modern security protocols allowing such a thing, but in the early 19th century, the White House operated under far looser rules. And Adams certainly wasn't the last president to receive an exotic animal as a diplomatic gift, though not everyone chose to keep theirs quite so close to home. 52. Martin Van Buren's tiger cubs. In the 1830s, President Martin Van Buren received an unusual diplomatic gift, 2 tiger cubs sent by the Sultan of Oman, as a gesture of goodwill between nations. Unlike Adams and his alligator, Van Buren apparently recognized that raising tiger cubs inside the White House posed a few practical challenges. Rather than keeping them on the grounds, he arranged for the cubs to be transferred to a zoo, where they could be properly cared for. Some accounts suggest Congress even had to get involved, debating what should be done with exotic gifts given to sitting presidents, since accepting such gifts personally raised certain ethical questions. The episode highlights just how often early American presidents found themselves navigating the unusual etiquette of international diplomacy, sometimes literally in the form of wild animals. It's a strange but charming footnote in White House history, showing that even gift-giving between nations could occasionally spiral into logistical headaches. And while Van Buren handled his exotic gift with caution, one 20th century president took a very different approach, embracing animal companionship on a much larger scale. 53. Theodore Roosevelt's bear. Theodore Roosevelt's family turned the White House into something resembling a small menagerie, with numerous animals living alongside them throughout his presidency. Among the more memorable was a bear reportedly named Jonathan Edwards, kept as a pet during Roosevelt's time in office. The Roosevelt household was known for embracing an adventurous, almost chaotic energy, with children and animals often roaming freely throughout the halls. Snakes, birds, a badger, and various other creatures rounded out what many staff members described as an unusually lively household compared to previous administrations. Roosevelt himself was famously fond of the outdoors and wildlife, So it perhaps wasn't surprising that this fascination carried directly into his family's private life at the White House. While safety standards today would likely prevent such arrangements, the era reflected a very different relationship between the presidency and personal indulgence. It remains one of the more colorful chapters in the long history of animals within the White House. And while Roosevelt embraced unconventional pets for personal enjoyment, one later president found a far more practical use for the animals kept on the grounds. 54. William Taft's cow Pauline Wayne. President William Howard Taft kept a cow named Pauline Wayne on the White House grounds, primarily to provide fresh milk for the household. Pauline arrived after an earlier White House cow retired, continuing what had briefly become a small tradition of dairy farming right in the nation's capital. She grazed openly on the lawn, becoming something of a local curiosity as tourists and reporters took notice of a cow calmly living just steps from the Oval Office. Pauline Wayne is often remembered as the last cow to officially reside at the White House, marking the end of an era before modern refrigeration and delivery systems made such practices unnecessary. It's a small but telling detail about how self-sufficient the White House once aimed to be, even in matters as simple as breakfast. Far removed from today's tightly controlled security perimeter, the grounds once functioned more like a working homestead than a fortress. These quieter, almost whimsical stories offer a gentler contrast to the weightier history surrounding the building. And as we continue exploring the White House's long and layered past, even stranger and more surprising details are still waiting to be uncovered. 55. Calvin Coolidge's raccoon Rebecca. In 1926, someone sent President Calvin Coolidge a raccoon, intending it to be the centerpiece of that year's Thanksgiving dinner. Coolidge, apparently not in the mood for raccoon stew, decided the animal deserved a better fate. He named her Rebecca and made her an official White House pet. Rebecca was given her own little enclosure on the grounds, though she reportedly spent plenty of time inside the residence as well, wandering halls and occasionally causing minor chaos among staff. She even joined the annual Easter egg roll, strolling the South Lawn on a leash like any other honored guest. Coolidge, known for his quiet, reserved public image, seemed to genuinely enjoy her company, a small glimpse of personality behind the famously stoic president. Rebecca eventually outgrew her time at the White House and was transferred to the Rock Creek Park Zoo once Coolidge left office. Still, for a few years, a raccoon meant for dinner instead became a beloved resident, wandering freely through one of the most powerful buildings in the world. And speaking of animals that captured hearts far beyond their intended purpose, one presidential pony became something of a neighborhood celebrity in her own right. 56. The Kennedy Pony Macaroni. During John F. Kennedy's presidency, his young daughter Caroline was given a pony named Macaroni, and the little animal quickly became one of the most photographed pets in White House history. Macaroni often grazed freely on the South Lawn, delighting staff, reporters, and visitors who caught glimpses of the pony trotting near one of the most secure buildings in the country. Caroline reportedly rode Macaroni around the grounds, and the pony even received sacks of fan mail from children across America who adored seeing such an ordinary animal in such an extraordinary setting. Macaroni became a symbol of the Kennedy family's more youthful, approachable image, offering a softer contrast to the weighty political dramas unfolding just steps away inside the Oval Office. The pony's popularity grew so much that newspapers occasionally ran updates on her well-being alongside actual policy coverage. It's a strange but oddly comforting reminder that even amid Cold War tensions and constant global uncertainty, a small pony could bring a moment of lightness to the nation's capital. And while Macaroni's story remains a cheerful memory, not every unexplained presence at the White House has been quite so easy to smile about. 57. The White House Ghost Stories. Beyond politics and pets, the White House carries a long tradition of ghost stories passed down by staff, guests, and even a few former residents. Many center around unexplained sounds, cold spots, or fleeting figures glimpsed in hallways late at night. Some staff members have described hearing footsteps in empty corridors or doors opening and closing on their own. Others have reported feeling an inexplicable sense of being watched while walking through certain rooms after dark. None of these accounts can be verified, of course, and skeptics point out that old buildings naturally creak, shift, and settle in ways that can feel unsettling after midnight. Still, the stories persist generation after generation, often shared quietly among staff rather than publicized officially. Perhaps it's simply human nature to imagine presence in a building soaked with over 2 centuries of history, tragedy, and transition. Or perhaps something lingers within those historic walls that science hasn't quite explained. Either way, the White House's reputation as one of America's most storied haunted locations continues to intrigue visitors. And among all these ghostly tales, one particular figure appears again and again, tied to the president whose life ended tragically within these very walls. 58. Churchill's Lincoln Encounter. One of the most famous White House ghost stories involves Winston Churchill, who allegedly had an unnerving encounter during a stay in the Lincoln bedroom. According to the tale, Churchill stepped out of the bath one evening, cigar in hand, and came face to face with the apparition of Abraham Lincoln standing near the fireplace. Startled, Churchill reportedly remarked, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage," before Lincoln's figure supposedly vanished. Churchill was said to have refused to sleep in that particular room again for the remainder of his visit. It's a wonderfully dramatic story, the kind that seems almost too perfect to be entirely true. Historians note that the tale rests largely on later retellings, rather than first-hand documentation from Churchill himself, leaving its authenticity uncertain. Still, the story has become deeply embedded in White House folklore, repeated by tour guides and historians alike for decades. Whether fact, exaggeration, or complete invention, it reflects just how powerfully Lincoln's memory continues to linger within these walls. And Churchill wasn't the only notable figure said to have sensed something unexplainable near that same historic room. 59. Grace Coolidge's Phantom Guest. Long before Churchill's alleged encounter, First Lady Grace Coolidge reportedly described her own unsettling experience involving Lincoln's presence. According to the story, while standing near a window in the Yellow Oval Room, she said she felt an overwhelming sense that Lincoln was standing beside her, gazing out toward the horizon, as though lost in thought. She described the sensation as calm rather than frightening, more a quiet presence than a ghostly apparition. Grace Coolidge was known as a warm, imaginative woman, and some historians view her account as a personal reflection rather than literal proof of paranormal activity. Even so, her story has been repeated for nearly a century, adding another layer to the enduring legend surrounding Lincoln's spirit within the White House. Whether interpreted as genuine paranormal experience or simply the emotional weight of living inside a building steeped in tragedy, the story remains one of the earliest recorded accounts of Lincoln's supposed lingering presence. And while Lincoln's ghost remains the most talked about entity associated with the White House, he isn't the only spectral legend tied to the building's long, mysterious history. 60. The Demon Cat Legend. Perhaps the strangest of all White House ghost stories involves not a president, but a cat known in Washington folklore as the Demon Cat, or simply DC. According to legend, this spectral black cat appears within the halls of the Capitol and White House shortly before major national tragedies or turning points. Witnesses over the decades, mostly guards and night watchmen, have claimed to see a small cat that suddenly grows larger and more menacing before vanishing entirely into thin air. Some tie its appearances to significant historical events, treating it as an eerie omen rather than a simple urban legend. Skeptics argue the stories likely originated from actual stray cats that wandered government buildings, later exaggerated into something far more supernatural through repeated retellings. Still, the legend persists as one of Washington's most enduring pieces of folklore, blending humor, mystery, and a touch of genuine unease. Whether interpreted as harmless myth or something stranger, the Demon Cat remains a beloved piece of local mystery tied directly to the seat of American government. And as we continue drifting through the quieter, stranger corners of White House history, even more unusual tales are still waiting just beneath the surface. 61. The White House Curse Story. For generations, a persistent piece of folklore has suggested that the White House carries a kind of curse, one tied loosely to the pattern of tragedy that seems to follow certain presidencies. Believers point to the string of deaths, illnesses, and misfortunes that have touched various administrations, treating them as evidence of something dark woven into the building's history. Some versions of the story reference the so-called Curse of Tippecanoe, the idea that presidents elected in years ending in 0 were destined to die in office, a pattern that held true for over a century before finally breaking. Historians, however, tend to view these claims with healthy skepticism, noting that coincidence, poor medical care of earlier eras, and simple statistical probability explained far more than any supernatural force ever could. Still, the story persists, whispered among tourists and repeated in books about the building's more mysterious side. Whether curse or coincidence, the White House's long history of loss has left an undeniable mark on its legacy. And speaking of loss within these walls, one particular room has witnessed more solemn farewells than almost any other space in the building. 62. The East Room Funeral Chamber. Throughout its long history, the East Room has served many purposes, hosting weddings, press conferences, and grand celebrations, but it has also become known as something far more solemn, a funeral chamber for some of the nation's most significant figures. Presidents, first ladies, children, and other prominent Americans have lain in state here, their caskets surrounded by quiet mourners beneath their room's grand chandeliers. The tradition began early in the nation's history and continued for well over a century, transforming this elegant space into a place of both celebration and grief, depending on the occasion. Visitors touring the White House today often walk through the East Room without realizing just how many farewells have taken place within its walls. The mixture of joy and sorrow tied to this single room reflects the larger story of the White House itself, a building meant to represent both the triumphs and heartbreaks of a nation. Few funerals held here, however, carried the emotional weight of one particular president's final farewell, a moment that brought the entire country to a standstill. 63. The Lincoln Funeral in the East Room. After Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, his body was brought back to the White House, where it lay in state within the East Room before beginning its long funeral journey across the country. Thousands of mourners filed past his casket, many overwhelmed with grief for a president who had guided the nation through its darkest chapter, only to be taken so suddenly at the moment of victory. The room was draped in black fabric, and the atmosphere reportedly felt heavier than anything the White House had witnessed before. Following the viewing, Lincoln's body was placed aboard a funeral train that traveled through several states, allowing millions of Americans the chance to pay their respects along the route. The event marked one of the most significant moments of collective national mourning in American history. Nearly a century later, another president's death would bring a strikingly similar scene back to that same historic room, once again transforming celebration into sorrow within the walls of the East Room. 64. The Kennedy Funeral Vigil. In November 1963, following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, his flag-draped coffin was placed in the East Room for a private vigil before the more public ceremonies began. Family, close friends, and White House staff gathered quietly to pay their respects, the atmosphere heavy with shock and disbelief after such a sudden and violent loss. Jacqueline Kennedy, still in the early hours of her grief, reportedly insisted on many details of the ceremony herself, drawing inspiration from Lincoln's funeral nearly a century earlier. The similarities between the two events were striking, right down to the black draping and candle-lit vigil within that same historic room. After the East Room vigil, Kennedy's casket was moved to the Capitol Rotunda, where the public could pay their final respects before his funeral procession moved through the streets of Washington. The nation watched in mourning, and the East Room once again became a symbol of collective national grief. Yet not every death within the White House walls involved a president himself, as history reminds us with two remarkable first ladies. 65. The death of Letitia Tyler. Long before the more famous funerals of the 19th and 20th centuries, Letitia Tyler quietly became the first lady to die within the White House itself, in 1842. She had suffered a stroke several years earlier, leaving her in fragile health throughout much of her husband John Tyler's presidency. Confined largely to her upstairs quarters, she rarely appeared publicly, allowing her daughter-in-law to take over many official hostess duties. Her death marked a somber first in presidential history, a quiet reminder that the pressures and isolation of White House life could affect even those living just beyond the public eye. Her passing received relatively modest attention compared to later presidential deaths, reflecting both the more private nature of her illness and the simpler mourning customs of the era. Still, her death set a historical precedent that would tragically repeat itself decades later, when another First Lady's health would quietly decline within those same walls, far from the public gaze that so often defined life inside the White House. 66. The death of Caroline Harrison. Nearly 50 years after Letitia Tyler's passing, First Lady Caroline Harrison died of tuberculosis within the White House in 1892 during her husband Benjamin Harrison's presidency. Her illness had progressed slowly, and though she remained active in charitable and social causes for much of her time as First Lady, her health steadily declined as the disease took hold. She passed away just weeks before her husband's re-election campaign concluded, casting a shadow over what should have been a politically significant moment. Her death highlighted the often overlooked personal sacrifices tied to public life, a reminder that behind the ceremony and formality of the presidency existed real families facing real hardship. Like Letitia Tyler before her, Caroline Harrison's passing reflected the quieter, more private tragedies that have unfolded within the White House over the centuries, moments rarely remembered alongside the grander historical events tied to the building. Together, these stories remind us that beyond politics and power, the White House has always remained, first and foremost, a home. 67. Ellen Wilson's death. In August 1914, First Lady Ellen Wilson passed away inside the White House after a long battle with Bright's disease, a kidney ailment that had quietly worsened over months. She had spent much of her final year confined to her bedroom, her condition kept largely private out of respect for her husband's demanding responsibilities as war loomed in Europe. President Woodrow Wilson reportedly sat by her bedside for hours, overwhelmed with grief as her health declined. Her death made her the third First Lady to die within the White House, joining Letitia Tyler and Caroline Harrison in a somber lineage of loss tied to the residence. Public mourning was widespread, though overshadowed almost immediately by the outbreak of World War I just days later. Wilson himself reportedly sank into a deep depression following her passing, one that some historians believe shaped his emotional state during the early years of the war. Her death remains a quiet but significant reminder that the White House has always been a home first, capable of grief just like any other. And that grief, as history shows, has taken many forms within these walls. 68. The White House suicide of 1835. During Andrew Jackson's presidency, a lesser-known tragedy unfolded when a White House servant named Joseph Dorsey reportedly died by suicide within the building. Details from the era are sparse, as household staff rarely received the same documentation or attention given to prominent political figures. What little is known suggests the pressures of service life, isolation, and the rigid hierarchy of the household may have played a role in his despair. Servants at the time lived under constant scrutiny, often working long hours with little personal freedom or recognition. Incidents like this were rarely discussed openly, buried beneath the formal narratives of presidential achievement that dominated historical records. Some historians argue that such omissions reflect a broader pattern of erasing the struggles of those who kept the White House running behind the scenes. Whether the full story will ever be uncovered remains uncertain, but Dorsey's death stands as a quiet, largely forgotten tragedy within the building's long history. It's a sobering reminder that not every story preserved from the White House belongs to presidents or their families, and speaking of those often overlooked, the labor behind the scenes tells its own hidden history. 69. The lost White House laundry. Long before washing machines and modern conveniences, keeping the White House clean required an enormous, largely invisible operation. Linens, uniforms, and clothing for the entire household had to be washed by hand, boiled in heavy cauldrons, scrubbed against washboards, and hung to dry in designated areas hidden from public view. This work was physically exhausting, often performed by enslaved workers in the earliest decades, and later by paid domestic staff who labored in stifling heat near open fires and boiling water. The laundry rooms were tucked away in basements or outbuildings, far from the elegant halls where visitors and dignitaries walked. Few records exist detailing the individuals who performed this labor, their names and stories mostly lost to time. What remains is a quiet testament to the sheer scale of effort required to maintain the appearance of effortless elegance above stairs. Every pristine tablecloth or perfectly pressed uniform represented hours of unseen toil. It's a reminder that behind the polished image of the White House existed a constant, physically demanding effort to keep it running. 70. The servants' attic rooms. High above the grand halls and formal reception rooms, domestic workers once lived in cramped attic quarters tucked beneath the White House roof. These small rooms offered little comfort, often stifling in summer and freezing in winter, a stark contrast to the elegance just floors below. Servants lived in close physical proximity to the nation's most powerful family, yet remained almost entirely separate from official life, their existence largely invisible to visitors and even to some residents. Meals, sleeping schedules, and movement throughout the building were carefully controlled, reinforcing a strict social divide between those who served and those who were served. Despite living under the same roof as presidents, these workers rarely appear in the grand historical narratives told about the building. Their daily routines, friendships, and hardships remain mostly undocumented, existing only in fragments pieced together by historians studying White House records. The attic rooms stand as a physical reminder of how deeply hierarchy shaped everyday life within these walls, and how much of that history remains hidden above the rooms tourists actually see. 71. The White House household staff. Behind every state dinner, holiday celebration, and quiet family evening exists a dedicated team of workers who keep the White House functioning. Butlers, maids, cooks, ushers, florists, engineers, and electricians maintain the residence around the clock, often working through the night to prepare for events with little public recognition. Many staff members serve across multiple presidential administrations, becoming quiet keepers of institutional memory that outlasts any single president's term. Their loyalty and discretion are considered essential, as they witness private family moments alongside the more public political ones. Some staff members have worked at the White House for decades, forming deep personal bonds with families who come and go every 4 or 8 years. Despite their essential role, most Americans know little about the individuals who ensure the home functions smoothly. Their stories rarely make headlines, yet without them, the ceremonial image of the presidency would be impossible to maintain. It's a quiet reminder that history isn't only shaped by the people in the spotlight, but often by those working diligently just out of view. 72. The 1860s White House rats during the Civil War era. Accounts from staff and visitors describe the White House as surprisingly rundown, plagued by persistent rats and poor sanitation in various parts of the aging mansion. The building's infrastructure had not kept pace with its growing importance, leaving certain areas neglected, damp, and infested, despite the grandeur displayed in public rooms. Mary Todd Lincoln reportedly complained about the conditions, viewing them as embarrassing for a residence meant to represent the nation. Efforts to address the problem were often temporary, as funding and attention were consumed by the ongoing war effort. The contrast between the elegant public image of the White House and its neglected physical condition highlights just how much strain the building endured during times of national crisis. Rodents and decay existed just beyond the view of visiting dignitaries, hidden within walls and basements rarely seen by the public. It's a small but telling detail, one that reveals the gap between the polished symbol of American leadership and the very real, sometimes messy reality of maintaining such an old and heavily used home. 73. The White House plumbing problems. Just as the rats and decay revealed the gap between appearance and reality, the building's early plumbing told a similar story. Indoor plumbing arrived at the White House gradually throughout the 19th century, installed piecemeal as technology slowly caught up with the needs of a growing household. Early systems were notoriously unreliable, prone to clogs, leaks, and strange noises that echoed through the walls at odd hours. Pipes froze in winter, pressure fluctuated without warning, and repairs often required tearing into walls that had just been elegantly restored. Staff members were frequently called upon to manage these breakdowns quietly, ensuring that residents and guests never noticed the constant maintenance happening behind the scenes. Some presidents reportedly grew frustrated with malfunctioning bathrooms, while others simply learned to live with the inconvenience as part of residing in such an old building. The mansion's infrastructure was essentially playing catch-up with modern expectations for decades. It's a reminder that even the most powerful residence in the country wasn't immune to the everyday headaches of home ownership. And speaking of new technology causing complications, the telephone brought its own set of surprises. 74. The first White House telephone. In 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes had the first telephone installed inside the White House, a novelty at the time that few Americans had ever even seen. The original telephone number was remarkably simple, just the number 1, reflecting how early the White House was in adopting this emerging technology. Despite the historic installation, Practical use of the device was limited in its earliest years. Very few other locations in Washington had telephones to call, making the White House's line largely symbolic rather than functional. Some accounts suggest Hayes rarely used it himself, viewing it more as a curiosity than a genuine tool of communication. Staff had to slowly adapt to the idea that messages could travel instantly through wires, rather than by messenger or letter. It would take years before telephone infrastructure expanded enough to make the White House's line truly useful for daily governance. Still, the installation marked a quiet but significant turning point, foreshadowing just how central communication technology would eventually become to the presidency. And speaking of new inventions that unsettled their users, electric lighting arrived with its own set of anxieties. 75. The first White House electric lights. Electricity arrived at the White House in 1891 during Benjamin Harrison's presidency, bringing bright, modern lighting into a building long illuminated by gas lamps and candles. Rather than embracing the change enthusiastically, Harrison reportedly harbored a genuine fear of electric shocks. According to White House lore, he and his wife often avoided touching the light switches themselves, worried about being electrocuted by the unfamiliar technology. Staff members were frequently left responsible for turning lights on and off throughout the residence, sometimes leaving rooms illuminated all night, simply because no one wanted to risk touching the switches. This anxiety wasn't entirely unreasonable, as early electrical systems were far less safe and standardized than modern wiring, with faulty installations occasionally causing fires in buildings across the country. The Harrisons' cautious approach reflected a broader public uncertainty about electricity during this transitional era. Eventually, familiarity replaced fear, and electric lighting became a standard, unquestioned feature of the White House. It's a small but telling detail about how even presidents weren't immune to hesitancy toward new technology. And speaking of technology that quietly reshaped the presidency, recording devices would soon enter the picture in far more consequential ways. 76. The secret presidential recording systems. Several presidents secretly installed recording systems within the White House, capturing conversations that would later become invaluable historical resources, though not without raising serious ethical questions. These systems operated largely without the knowledge of visitors, staff members, and sometimes even close advisors, who had no idea their words were being preserved. The practice began as a way to maintain accurate records for future reference, allowing presidents to revisit important discussions or protect themselves against misrepresentation. Over time, however, these recordings revealed far more than intended, capturing candid remarks, private strategizing, and moments never meant for public consumption. Historians consider these archives extraordinarily valuable, offering rare unfiltered glimpses into presidential decision-making during pivotal moments. At the same time, the secrecy involved raises lingering questions about consent and privacy, since many of the individuals recorded never agreed to be part of the historical record. These systems varied in scope and duration across different administrations, some running continuously and others activated only during specific meetings. And speaking of a recording system that eventually reshaped American political history entirely, few compare to the one installed by Richard Nixon. 77. Nixon's Oval Office tapes. Richard Nixon's secret taping system, installed to automatically record conversations within the Oval Office, ultimately became one of the most consequential recording systems in presidential history. Originally intended to help Nixon maintain accurate records for his memoirs, the system captured far more than routine discussions. When the Watergate scandal erupted, investigators discovered that these tapes contained crucial conversations directly tied to the cover-up of the break-in and subsequent efforts to obstruct the investigation. Nixon fought fiercely to keep the tapes private, citing executive privilege, but the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that he had to release them. The recordings revealed conversations that implicated Nixon in efforts to obstruct justice, providing damning evidence that accelerated his political downfall. Portions of the tapes included an 18.5-minute gap, a mysterious erasure that has never been fully explained, fueling decades of speculation about what exactly was recorded during that missing segment. The scandal ultimately led to Nixon's resignation in 1974, making his taping system a cautionary tale about hidden recordings and their power to reshape history. And speaking of presidents secretly recording history in real time, Nixon wasn't the first to do so. 78. Kennedy's secret recordings. Long before Nixon's tapes became infamous, John F. Kennedy quietly operated his own secret recording system within the Oval Office, capturing conversations during some of the most tense moments of his presidency. Kennedy reportedly began recording meetings in 1962, using hidden microphones to preserve discussions for future reference, all without informing most of the people in the room. Among the most historically significant recordings are conversations captured during the Cuban Missile Crisis, offering an extraordinary glimpse into the deliberations that unfolded as the world edged toward potential nuclear conflict. These recordings reveal advisors debating military options, diplomatic strategies, and the immense pressure surrounding decisions that could have altered the course of history. Unlike Nixon's tapes, Kennedy's recordings remain largely unknown to the public until years after his assassination, when archivists and historians gradually uncovered their existence. The tapes have since become invaluable resources for understanding Cold War decision-making at its most critical juncture. They also raise similar ethical questions about privacy and consent, since many participants had no idea their candid remarks were being preserved for future scrutiny. It's a quiet reminder that hidden recordings have shaped presidential history more often than most Americans realize. 79. Johnson's telephone tapes. Before Nixon's system became infamous, Lyndon Johnson was busy recording his own telephone calls, capturing candid conversations about war, politics, and civil rights. Johnson reportedly began the practice shortly after taking office, using a hidden system to preserve calls with senators, advisors, and even reporters. The recordings offer remarkably unfiltered insight into how Johnson operated behind the scenes, revealing the persuasion, pressure, and sometimes blunt language he used to push legislation like the Civil Rights Act through Congress. They also capture his private anguish over the escalating Vietnam War, offering historians a window into the doubts he rarely expressed publicly. Like Kennedy's recordings, most participants had no idea their words were being preserved for posterity. Johnson's tapes have since become essential resources for understanding one of the most consequential presidencies of the 20th century. They remind us that long before Watergate made secret recordings notorious, they were already a quiet fixture of White House life. And speaking of presidential secrets that eventually became public scandals, few compare to what happened next. 80. The Watergate Connection. What began as a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in 1972 slowly transformed into a crisis that reached directly into the White House itself. Investigators discovered that individuals connected to Nixon's re-election campaign were involved in the burglary, and further digging revealed a broader pattern of political espionage and dirty tricks. As journalists and congressional investigators pulled at the threads, evidence increasingly pointed toward administration officials who had either authorized or attempted to cover up the operation. The White House found itself at the center of a scandal that raised fundamental questions about the limits of presidential power. Aides resigned, testified, and in some cases faced criminal charges, as the scope of the cover-up became impossible to ignore. What made Watergate especially significant wasn't simply the break-in, but the extensive effort to conceal it, an effort that ultimately unraveled under public and legal scrutiny. The scandal remains one of the defining moments in American political history. And speaking of desperate measures taken to control the fallout, Nixon's next move only deepened the crisis. 81. The Saturday Night Massacre. As Watergate investigations intensified, Nixon ordered the dismissal of Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor overseeing the case, triggering one of the most dramatic nights in White House history. When Attorney General Elliot Richardson refused to carry out the order, he resigned in protest. His deputy, William Ruckelshaus, also refused and was fired. It ultimately fell to Solicitor General Robert Bork to dismiss Cox, an act that stunned the nation and became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The event sparked immediate public outrage, with many viewing it as a blatant attempt to obstruct justice from within the highest office in the land. Congress responded with renewed determination, and calls for impeachment grew louder in the aftermath. Legal scholars still debate the constitutional implications of that night, particularly regarding the limits of executive authority over independent investigations. The episode remains a striking example of how quickly a crisis of accountability can escalate. And speaking of unresolved mysteries from that same turbulent chapter, one recording in particular has never stopped raising questions. 82. The missing 18 and a half minutes. Among Nixon's secret recordings, one tape stands out for a peculiar and unresolved mystery, an erased gap lasting 18.5 minutes. The segment reportedly covered a conversation between Nixon and his chief of staff, H. R. Haldeman, just days after the Watergate break-in, a period widely believed to contain discussion of the scandal itself. Nixon's secretary, Rose Mary Woods, claimed she accidentally erased part of the tape while transcribing it, though her explanation struggled to account for the full length of the gap. Technical experts who examined the tape found that the erasure appeared to involve multiple separate actions, raising further questions about intent. To this day, no one has definitively explained who created the gap or what exactly it concealed. The mystery has fueled decades of speculation among historians, journalists, and conspiracy theorists alike. Whether it was an innocent accident or a deliberate cover-up remains, quite literally, a matter of missing evidence. And speaking of secretive units formed to manage sensitive information, Nixon's White House had another quiet operation running in parallel. 83. The White House Plumbers. In 1971, following the leak of the Pentagon Papers, the Nixon administration formed a covert unit informally known as the Plumbers, tasked with preventing further disclosures of classified information. The group operated outside conventional oversight, conducting operations that included breaking into the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist in search of damaging material. Members of this unit later became directly involved in the Watergate break-in, linking the two scandals together in the public imagination. The Plumbers represented a broader pattern of the administration using covert tactics to manage political threats, often blurring the line between national security and political self-preservation. Congressional investigations eventually exposed the unit's activities, revealing just how far some officials were willing to go to protect the administration from embarrassment. The revelations deepened public distrust in the executive branch during an already turbulent era. It remains a striking example of how secrecy, once normalized, can quietly expand into far riskier territory. And speaking of covert operations that later drew congressional scrutiny, a very different administration would face similar questions years later. 84. The Iran-Contra Operations Room. During the Reagan administration, staff members reportedly used White House offices to help coordinate a set of covert operations that later became known as the Iran-Contra affair. The arrangement allegedly involved selling arms to Iran, with proceeds secretly funneled to support Contra rebels in Nicaragua, despite congressional restrictions on such funding. When details began surfacing in 1986, they triggered a major congressional investigation into how much the president and his senior officials knew about the operation. Testimony revealed a complex web of communications, memos, and meetings that stretched across multiple agencies, raising serious questions about oversight and accountability within the executive branch. Some officials faced criminal charges, while others received pardons years later. Reagan maintained that he was unaware of the full scope of the operation, though critics remained skeptical given how closely it was managed from within his own administration. The affair remains a significant example of how covert foreign policy decisions can quietly unfold behind the ordinary business of the White House. 85. The 1985 White House cocaine discovery. According to reports from the period, a small amount of cocaine was allegedly discovered somewhere within White House grounds during the Reagan administration, though details remain frustratingly vague. The story surfaced amid a broader era of drug scandals sweeping through Washington, with staffers and even a few notable figures facing accusations of recreational drug use. Officials at the time downplayed the discovery, offering little in the way of explanation about how the substance got there, or who might have been responsible. No formal investigation seems to have identified a culprit, and the incident faded from headlines almost as quickly as it appeared. Some historians view it as a minor footnote, a strange but ultimately inconsequential blip in an administration otherwise focused on Cold War politics. Others find it a curious symbol of just how porous White House security and accountability could sometimes be. Either way, the mystery of who brought cocaine into America's most famous building has never been solved. And speaking of records that raised uncomfortable questions decades later, the digital age brought its own version of missing evidence. 86. The Clinton White House email controversies. As electronic communication became standard practice in the 1990s, the Clinton administration found itself navigating uncharted territory, when it came to preserving digital records. Investigators later discovered that certain emails from White House staff had gone missing or were improperly archived, raising concerns among congressional committees and government watchdog groups. Some of these communications were relevant to ongoing investigations, including inquiries into campaign finance practices, which only intensified scrutiny over the gaps. Officials attributed the losses to technical glitches and inadequate archiving systems rather than any deliberate attempt at concealment, though critics remain skeptical. The controversy highlighted a broader problem facing the federal government at the time: the struggle to apply old record-keeping laws to new forms of communication. Legal battles over the missing emails dragged on for years, with transparency advocates arguing that accountability shouldn't depend on outdated technology. The episode became an early lesson in just how complicated digital preservation could become at the highest levels of government. And speaking of digital records that vanished under mysterious circumstances, another administration would soon face a strikingly similar problem. 87. The Bush administration missing emails. During the George W. Bush administration, reports emerged that millions of White House emails had seemingly disappeared, sparking concern among archivists, watchdog groups, and members of Congress. The missing messages reportedly spanned a period that included discussions relevant to several controversial policy decisions, making their absence all the more troubling to investigators. Officials initially attributed the gaps to technical failures within the White House's email archiving system, insisting there was no intent to conceal anything. Following legal pressure from oversight organizations, a lengthy recovery effort eventually located and restored a significant portion of the missing communications from backup systems. The process took years to complete, and questions lingered about what, if anything, remained permanently lost. Critics argued that record preservation had clearly not kept pace with the realities of digital communication inside the executive branch. Supporters countered that the recovery effort ultimately demonstrated a commitment to transparency, even if the initial failure raised eyebrows. The episode remains a reminder of how fragile digital history can be. And speaking of physical objects meant to preserve history rather than erase it, the White House has always had a peculiar relationship with its own tableware. 88. The White House China Collection. Each presidential administration traditionally commissions its own set of official china, a tradition that has quietly created chaos in the White House's storage rooms for over 2 centuries. Some sets have been lost to breakage over the years, victims of state dinners, careless staff, or simple accidents involving centuries-old porcelain. Other sets have become the subject of controversy, either for their extravagant cost during politically sensitive times or for stylistic choices that clashed with the First Lady's personal taste. Nancy Reagan's China selection, for example, drew criticism for its price tag amid economic hardship elsewhere in the country. Meanwhile, older sets from administrations like Lincoln's or Hayes's have become treasured historical artifacts, carefully preserved rather than used. The state dining room's china cabinets hold fragments of nearly every presidency, a fragile timeline of taste, politics, and public perception. Even something as simple as a dinner plate, it turns out, can become a quiet symbol of an administration's priorities. And speaking of items carefully tracked to prevent loss, the White House keeps an entire vault dedicated to exactly that purpose. 89. The White House Silver Vault. Deep within the building's storage areas lies a carefully maintained collection of historic silver, china, furniture, and decorative objects, all meticulously cataloged as federal property. Every item is tracked with remarkable precision, from ornate serving trays used at state dinners to smaller decorative pieces tied to specific administrations. The vault exists partly to preserve history and partly to prevent the kind of quiet disappearances that have plagued other collections over the decades. Curators work continuously to document, restore, and safeguard these objects, ensuring that pieces from Lincoln's era sit alongside items from far more recent administrations. Some pieces carry fascinating provenance, having survived fires, renovations, and even wartime evacuations of the building. The sheer scale of the inventory reflects just how seriously the White House treats its role as a living museum, even as it functions as a working residence. It's a quiet reminder that behind the political drama, someone is always keeping careful track of the silverware. And speaking of structures built with more consideration than their appearance suggests, one particular balcony hid an unexpected engineering story. 90. The Truman balcony's secret support. When President Truman added a balcony to the south portico in 1948, the visible result seemed like a simple architectural addition, but the structural reality was far more complex. Engineers had to carefully integrate the balcony's support system into the building's aging frame, working around concerns that had already prompted a full structural renovation of the White House just a few years later. Some accounts suggest that the balcony's construction inadvertently revealed just how fragile the building's interior framework had become, contributing to the decision to gut and rebuild the White House's internal structure entirely. Critics at the time focused mainly on the balcony's appearance, arguing it disrupted the mansion's classical symmetry, while the more serious structural conversations happened quietly behind the scenes. Today, the balcony is best known as a peaceful spot for presidential families, rather than a source of controversy. Few visitors realize that its addition intersected with one of the most significant structural crises in the building's history. It stands now as a quiet reminder that even small changes can uncover much larger problems. 91. The White House time capsule rumors. Every so often, stories circulate online claiming that a hidden time capsule exists somewhere within the White House, supposedly buried by a past president to preserve messages, artifacts, or predictions for future generations. Enthusiasts point to renovation periods, especially the Truman reconstruction, as prime opportunities for such a capsule to have been sealed away. Despite the persistence of these claims, no credible documentation or verified discovery has ever surfaced to confirm their existence. Historians who studied the building's archives note that no official records mention burying anything resembling a time capsule during major construction projects. Still, the idea persists, fueled partly by the White House's genuine history of hidden compartments and partly by simple human fascination with buried secrets. Some suggest the rumors may have originated from confusion with cornerstone ceremonies rather than an actual sealed capsule. Until stronger evidence emerges, the story remains firmly in the realm of speculation. And speaking of buried objects tied to the building's earliest days, one particular stone has proven even harder to track down than any rumored capsule. 92. The Cornerstone Mystery. In 1792, workers laid the White House's original cornerstone during a ceremony marking the start of construction, a stone believed to contain commemorative items sealed inside according to tradition of the era. Despite its historical significance, the exact location of that cornerstone has never been definitively confirmed. Multiple search efforts over the centuries, including ones prompted by curious historians and preservationists, have failed to locate it with certainty. Some researchers believe later renovations, particularly the extensive reconstruction under Truman, may have covered or even accidentally destroyed the stone without anyone realizing its significance at the time. Others argue records from the original ceremony were simply too vague to pinpoint its placement accurately. The mystery has become something of a quiet obsession among architectural historians who continue combing old documents for clues. Whether it still exists intact somewhere within the foundation, or was lost decades ago, remains unknown. And speaking of architectural mysteries tied to the building's founding period, some observers have looked toward its design for hidden meaning entirely. 93. Freemason symbolism claims. Because several key figures involved in Washington, D.C.'s early planning, including some architects and officials, were Freemasons, theories have long circulated suggesting hidden Masonic symbolism embedded within the White House and surrounding city layout. Proponents point to geometric patterns, cornerstone ceremonies conducted with Masonic rituals, and alignments some claim mirror Masonic symbols when viewed from above. Historians generally caution against reading too much into these patterns, noting that many alleged connections rely on selective interpretation rather than verified documentation. It is true that Masonic ceremonies accompanied certain construction milestones, a common practice for public buildings during that era, but that alone doesn't confirm intentional symbolic design throughout the architecture. Researchers who study Freemasonry's influence on early American institutions describe most of these claims as more speculative folklore than historical fact. Still, the theories remain popular among certain circles fascinated by hidden meanings in government architecture. Whether coincidence or design, the debate continues without clear resolution. And speaking of details lost to interpretation over time, even the building's own name took decades to settle into what we recognize today. 94. The White House's original name. For much of its early history, the building wasn't officially called the White House at all. It was commonly referred to as the President's House or the Executive Mansion, reflecting its formal governmental function rather than any particular architectural feature. The nickname White House emerged informally, likely inspired by the building's distinctive white painted exterior, and gradually gained popularity among the public and press throughout the 19th century. Despite its growing use, official government correspondence continued favoring more formal titles for decades. Various presidents and administrations used the terms somewhat interchangeably, adding to the historical confusion around when exactly the nickname became dominant. It wasn't until a specific presidential decision that the informal name finally received formal recognition. And speaking of that long-awaited formal decision, one president decided it was finally time to make things official. 95. The 1901 official naming. In 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt formally standardized the name White House, ordering it printed on official stationery and government correspondence. Roosevelt felt the nickname had become so widely recognized that continuing to use more formal titles seemed unnecessarily outdated. His decision effectively cemented the name into official government use, ending decades of inconsistent terminology. The move reflected Roosevelt's broader approach to modernizing various aspects of the presidency during his time in office. Since then, White House has remained the universally recognized name, appearing on everything from press releases to historical records. It's a small but interesting example of how informal public habits can eventually shape official government language. And speaking of naming conventions tied to presidential protection, another practice quietly became standard around national security concerns. 96. The Secret Service code names. Presidents, first ladies, and their family members are each assigned code names by the Secret Service, a tradition dating back to earlier decades when secure radio communication was far less reliable. These names were originally intended purely for practical purposes, allowing agents to communicate quickly and clearly over radio channels without confusion. Over time, the tradition became something of a quiet cultural curiosity, with each family's chosen names often reflecting personality traits or family preferences. While the original security necessity has diminished with modern encrypted communications, the practice has continued largely out of tradition. Some code names have become publicly known over the years, occasionally revealing amusing or sentimental family choices. Though largely symbolic today, the tradition remains a small but enduring piece of White House security culture. 97. The White House's nuclear emergency planning. During the height of the Cold War, successive administrations quietly developed continuity of government plans designed to keep the presidency functioning in the event of a catastrophic nuclear attack. These plans reportedly included secret evacuation routes, underground facilities, and protocols for transferring power if the White House itself became unreachable or destroyed. Much of this planning took place away from public view, coordinated through agencies most Americans never knew existed at the time. While some details have gradually surfaced through declassified documents, large portions remain sealed, considered too sensitive for public release, even decades later. Historians who study Cold War-era preparedness note that the secrecy wasn't necessarily about hiding wrongdoing, but about maintaining strategic advantage during a period defined by constant existential threat. Still, the lack of transparency has fueled endless speculation about what exactly these plans entailed. And speaking of secrecy surrounding presidential survival, one particular object has become a symbol of that hidden apparatus. 98. The Presidential Doomsday Briefcase. Wherever the president travels, a military aide remains close by, carrying a briefcase informally known as the nuclear football. Popular imagination often portrays it as containing a single red button capable of launching nuclear weapons instantly. But the reality, as far as declassified information suggests, is considerably more procedural. The briefcase reportedly contains authentication materials and strategic options meant to guide communication with military command in the event of a crisis, rather than any simple activation device. Its exact contents remain classified, and few people outside a small circle have ever seen inside it. Because of this secrecy, myths about the briefcase have flourished for decades, some more accurate than others. What is confirmed is that it symbolizes the enormous and largely invisible responsibility tied to the presidency, quietly following the office wherever it goes. And speaking of quiet burdens hidden behind public appearances, the president's own home carries its own version of that tension. 99. The residence above the power. Beneath the grandeur of press conferences and formal ceremonies lies something far more ordinary, a private home where presidents and their families attempt to live something resembling normal life. Bedrooms, kitchens, and living spaces exist just above rooms where history-altering decisions are made daily. Yet privacy remains elusive, with agents, staff, and security personnel present at nearly every hour. Children have grown up here, meals have been shared here, and quiet family moments have unfolded here, all while under constant, necessary surveillance. Some former residents have described the strange duality of raising a family inside a building that also functions as a heavily fortified national symbol. It's a reminder that behind the marble columns and iconic photographs, real people navigate real lives shaped by extraordinary scrutiny. And with that quiet image of ordinary life tucked inside extraordinary walls, we close this long walk through the shadows of American history, leaving the White House standing exactly as it always has, familiar, mysterious, and endlessly complicated.